Hello everyone and welcome to my channel Y&R Trends. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. In the dim, cavernous silence of the Newman Ranch living room, where shadows stretched like ghosts across the walls and the crackling fireplace sounded more like a countdown than comfort, Nikki Newman stood frozen with a small black USB drive clenched in her trembling hand, her breath shallow, her heart pounding so violently it felt as though it might betray her before she could betray the man she once loved more than life itself, because this tiny device, so insignificant in appearance, had detonated everything she believed about Victor Newman, the titan she married, divorced, defended, and nearly destroyed herself for. And as she stared across the room at him, seated calmly in his leather chair with that infuriatingly unreadable expression, Nikki realized with bone-chilling clarity that this USB wasn't just data. It was a confession, a graveyard of secrets, a digital executioner that had been hiding in plain sight for decades, and it had come to her through a chain of blood, betrayal, and silence that began months earlier when an anonymous envelope arrived at the athletic club addressed simply to Mrs. Newman, containing nothing but the drive and a handwritten note that read, "If you want the truth about Victor, press play." And at first Nikki had laughed it off, assuming it was another desperate attempt by one of Victor's many enemies to fracture their already fragile détente, but something about the weight of the envelope, the shaky penmanship, the unmistakable sense of fear embedded in every letter, compelled her to wait until she was alone, until the club emptied, until even the ghosts of Genoa City seemed to hold their breath, and when she inserted the USB into her laptop, she expected blackmail, financial corruption, maybe an affair or two, but instead she found folders, meticulously organized, time-stamped, and labeled with names she recognized all too well: Adam, Ashland, JT, Diane, Chavez, Phoenix, and with each click her world cracked wider, revealing encrypted audio files of Victor ordering surveillance, video footage of bribes exchanged in underground parking garages, scanned contracts signed under duress, hospital records altered to erase paternity, and most damning of all, a series of voice recordings, Victor's unmistakable voice, cold, calculated, and devoid of the moral justifications he usually cloaked himself in, discussing how far someone would need to be removed if they threatened the Newman empire. And Nikki felt herself growing nauseous as she listened to him casually reference people not as lives but as liabilities, including a recording dated years earlier where he spoke of Nikki herself, saying that keeping her dependent keeps her loyal, words that sliced through her like glass, forcing her to confront the horrifying possibility that even her battles with addiction had been weaponized by the man she trusted to save her. And as the files continued, Nikki discovered evidence tying Victor to crimes that had never officially been solved, accidents that weren't accidents, suicides that weren't suicides, financial collapses that led to ruined families, all orchestrated through layers of shell companies, proxies, and loyal soldiers who had long since vanished or been silenced. And she realized the sender wasn't trying to destroy Victor with exposure but was instead passing the burden of truth to the one person who could destroy him emotionally, morally, and permanently. Because Nikki wasn't just his ex-wife, she was his conscience, the only person whose judgment he still feared. And as days passed, Nikki became a woman haunted, unable to sleep, drink, or breathe without hearing Victor's voice echoing through those recordings, watching him smile at her across dinner tables while knowing he had destroyed lives without hesitation. And when she confronted Jack Abbott in secret, showing him only a fraction of what she'd found, even Jack, hardened by decades of war with Victor, was shaken into silence, warning her that releasing this information would bring chaos not only to Victor but to their children, to Newman Enterprises, to Genoa City itself, because Victor's empire was intertwined with everything, and Nikki found herself trapped between justice and collateral damage, between truth and blood, until the final file revealed itself. A hidden folder titled simply Nikki, containing a single video recorded years earlier, where Victor admitted to orchestrating events that pushed her toward relapse, manipulating circumstances so she would lean on him, depend on him, stay tethered to him emotionally when she was drifting away. And as Nikki watched herself unravel on screen while Victor narrated it like a chess match he had won, something inside her snapped, the love she still carried collapsing under the weight of unforgivable truth. And that was the moment she decided Victor had to face her, not as a king or a husband or a myth, but as a man stripped bare by his own words. And now, here they were, the USB sitting on the table between them like a loaded weapon, Nikki holding an actual gun in her other hand, not out of premeditation but out of necessity, because confronting Victor Newman without leverage was suicide. And when Victor finally spoke, his voice calm but edged with warning, asking her why she looked at him like a stranger, Nikki pressed the remote and filled the room with his own voice, confessing to crimes he had never imagined Nikki would hear. And for the first time in his life, Victor Newman was speechless, his mask cracking as Nikki listed every betrayal, every manipulation, every life he'd crushed, her voice breaking not with fear but with grief. And when Victor tried to justify himself, claiming it was all for family, for survival, for love, Nikki raised the gun, tears streaming down her face as she told him love does not destroy the soul of the woman you claim to protect. And for one suspended moment time itself seemed to fracture. The sound of Nikki's ragged breathing, louder than the fire, louder than Victor's racing thoughts, louder than decades of power and fear, and Victor, staring down the barrel of the gun, finally understood that this was not about exposure or prison or death but about judgment, because Nikki wasn't deciding whether to shoot him, she was deciding whether the man before her deserved to keep existing as Victor Newman, or whether the truth contained in that USB would erase him completely. And as sirens echoed faintly in the distance, summoned not by Nikki but by a failsafe embedded in the USB that would auto-release its contents to authorities if it wasn't reinserted within the hour, Victor reached out not as a tyrant but as a broken man, whispering her name, and Nikki, lowering the gun but not the truth, told him the empire he built on fear would now stand on accountability, because she would not kill him, but she would let the truth do something far more devastating. Expose him to the world without her protection, without her silence, without her love. And as Nikki walked out of the ranch with the USB still in her possession, leaving Victor alone with the wreckage of his own making, Genoa City stood on the brink of a reckoning that would change every life tied to the Newman name forever. In the aftermath of Nikki Newman's departure from the ranch, the silence she left behind was not empty but suffocating, pressing in on Victor Newman like a living thing as he remained seated long after the door closed, staring at the space where she had stood with the gun lowered but the truth raised higher than any weapon he had ever faced. And for the first time in his life, Victor did not reach for a phone, did not bark orders, did not summon lawyers or fixers or loyal soldiers, because every instinct he possessed told him that nothing, no amount of money, intimidation or manipulation, could undo what had just happened, since the real damage was not the USB itself but the certainty in Nikki's eyes that she finally saw him clearly, and that realization gnawed at him as memories surfaced unbidden, memories of moments he had always reframed as necessary sacrifices but now appeared disturbingly different when viewed through the lens of exposure, because Victor knew that Nikki was not a woman who bluffed when it came to moral lines, and if she had walked away without destroying him outright, it was not mercy but resolve, the resolve to let the truth take its slow, devastating course. And as Victor rose and poured himself a drink with an unsteady hand, the ranch felt smaller, almost claustrophobic, as if the walls themselves were listening, recording, cataloging his sins just like that cursed USB, while across town Nikki drove aimlessly through Genoa City, tears blurring the lights as decades of love, rage, regret, and relief crashed over her in waves, because leaving Victor alive but unprotected felt simultaneously like liberation and mourning, as though she had finally buried the man she loved while the man he truly was still walked the earth. And with every mile she put between herself and the ranch, Nikki replayed the moment Victor's composure cracked, knowing that she had inflicted a wound no enemy ever had. And yet the weight of what she now carried, the power to expose Victor Newman to the world, felt heavier than any gun, heavier than any addiction she had ever battled, because she understood better than anyone that Victor's fall would not be isolated, that it would tear through their children, their grandchildren, and the fragile ecosystem of Genoa City itself. And when Nikki finally pulled over near Chancellor Park, clutching the USB like a talisman and a curse, she allowed herself to break down completely, sobbing not just for herself but for the woman she had been when she believed love could redeem a man who never truly wanted redemption, only control. And as dawn approached, Nikki made her decision not to run or hide but to prepare, because Victor would not sit idle forever, and even stripped of her silence he was still Victor Newman, a man whose survival instinct was unmatched. And sure enough, by morning Victor had begun moving pieces on the board, summoning Michael Baldwin not with his usual thunderous authority but with a quiet urgency that unsettled even his most loyal attorney, as Victor laid out only fragments of the situation, carefully omitting Nikki's role while emphasizing the existence of potentially catastrophic evidence. And Michael, seasoned as he was, immediately recognized the danger, warning Victor that any attempt to suppress or destroy the material could trigger legal consequences far worse than exposure, especially if Nikki had already established safeguards, which Victor neither confirmed nor denied. His silence speaking volumes as he ordered Michael to find out who created the USB, who had access to it, and how many copies might exist, because if Victor could not control the truth, he would at least attempt to contain it, while elsewhere Jack Abbott watched developments with wary anticipation after Nikki contacted him again, this time not with hesitation but with grim clarity, revealing the full scope of what she possessed, and Jack, torn between his lifelong desire to see Victor finally face justice and his concern for the collateral damage such exposure would cause, urged Nikki to proceed carefully, reminding her that once the truth was released it could not be recalled, and Nikki, exhausted but resolute, told Jack she was done protecting Victor from himself, because every day of silence had been another day of complicity, and as word began to ripple through Genoa City's inner circles that something seismic was coming, alliances shifted subtly, eyes narrowed and long buried. Grudges stirred, with Phyllis Summer sensing opportunity in chaos, Ashley Abbott fearing corporate fallout, and Adam Newman feeling an inexplicable dread that whatever was about to surface would finally explain the lifelong sense that his pain had always been part of a larger design. And when Nikki finally confronted Victoria and Nick, the conversation shattered what remained of the illusion that their father's sins were exaggerated by enemies, because Nikki showed them select pieces of the evidence, not enough to overwhelm but enough to devastate. And as Victoria struggled to reconcile the ruthless businessman she admired with the manipulative architect revealed by the recordings, Nick's anger ignited instantly, demanding to know how long Nikki had known and why she hadn't acted sooner, and Nikki, voice breaking, confessed that love had blinded her, that fear had silenced her, and that she would live with that guilt forever. But she would not let it continue, and the siblings, united not in loyalty to their father but in shock and betrayal, faced an impossible choice. Stand by Victor and become complicit, or stand by the truth and risk destroying the family name forever. And as the days passed, Victor began to feel the walls closing in, not from law enforcement or the media but from his own blood. As calls went unanswered, meetings were postponed, and the familiar deference he commanded gave way to wary distance. And in rare moments of solitude Victor allowed himself to feel something dangerously close to regret, not for the crimes themselves, which he still rationalized as survival, but for the one line he had crossed that could never be justified, turning Nikki's vulnerability into leverage. And when he finally confronted her again, tracking her down to a quiet room at the athletic club where their history had unfolded so many times before, Victor did not threaten or plead but simply asked if there was any way back from this, and Nikki, meeting his gaze with heartbreaking calm, told him that forgiveness was possible but silence was not, that accountability was the price of any future, and Victor, realizing that the woman who once saved him now stood as the gatekeeper to his reckoning, felt something he had spent a lifetime avoiding, the terror of being truly powerless. And as Nikki walked away once more, leaving Victor alone with the consequences of his choices, Genoa City braced itself for the fallout, because the USB that broke Nikki had not just exposed Victor's darkest crimes, it had ignited a chain reaction that would force every character to confront the uncomfortable truth that power without conscience eventually consumes everything it touches. And the storm was only just beginning. Chadibi. As the storm Nikki had unleashed continued to gather force, Genoa City entered a strange, electric limbo where nothing had officially changed yet everything felt irrevocably altered, because rumors, never specific but always ominous, began to circulate through boardrooms, hospital corridors and society galas, whispers that Victor Newman's armor had finally cracked, that the man who had outmaneuvered enemies for decades was now vulnerable in a way no hostile takeover or prison sentence had ever made him. And at the center of that storm stood Nikki, exhausted but unyielding, aware that every step she took was now being watched, weighed and interpreted, yet refusing to retreat into the shadows again, because she understood that this moment demanded visibility, courage and endurance. And when the media first began sniffing around, calls from reporters hinting they had received anonymous tips about forthcoming revelations tied to Newman Enterprises, Nikki recognized Victor's old world, colliding violently with a new one where secrets did not stay buried. And while Victor attempted to project business as usual, making public appearances with his trademark steel-eyed confidence, those closest to him could see the cracks forming beneath the surface, his temper flaring unpredictably, his patience wearing thin, because every smile he offered to the cameras was haunted by the knowledge that somewhere, in a location he could not control, the truth existed in a form that could destroy him with a single click. And as Michael Baldwin scrambled behind the scenes to erect legal firewalls, filing preemptive motions and quietly contacting prosecutors to gauge exposure without implicating his client further, even he began to sense that this crisis was different, because it wasn't driven by ambition or revenge but by moral reckoning, the most dangerous adversary Victor Newman had ever faced. And as Adam watched his father unravel, fragments of his own tortured past began to align into a horrifying pattern. Moments when Victor had pushed him away only to pull him back, sabotaged relationships, manipulated outcomes, and now Adam couldn't shake the suspicion that his pain had never been collateral damage but intentional design. And when Adam confronted Nikki privately, demanding the full truth rather than curated fragments, Nikki hesitated only briefly before handing him a separate drive, smaller, redacted, but devastating, containing files that chronicled Victor's orchestration of events in Adam's life with chilling precision. And as Adam absorbed the evidence, rage and grief collided inside him, because the father he had alternately worshipped and despised was suddenly revealed as the architect of his suffering, and Adam's vow to expose Victor became deeply personal, transforming him from conflicted son into relentless adversary, while Victoria, torn between loyalty and leadership, faced mounting pressure within Newman Enterprises as shareholders began asking questions, sensing instability at the top. And when Victoria proposed internal audits and transparency initiatives to stabilize the company, Victor rejected them outright, seeing them as admissions of guilt, further widening the rift between father and daughter. And Nick, increasingly vocal in his condemnation, publicly distanced himself from Victor, resigning from the board and igniting speculation that the Newman family itself was fracturing. And through it all, Nikki became both symbol and scapegoat, praised quietly by some for her courage while condemned by others for betraying Victor, accusations that stung but did not deter her, because she knew that truth often demanded the sacrifice of reputation. And as she worked closely with legal counsel to prepare for the inevitable release of the USB's contents, Nikki insisted on one condition that stunned everyone involved: the evidence would be released in full, without spin, without selective leaks, because she refused to let Victor claim he was being targeted unfairly, believing that only total transparency could prevent him from rewriting the narrative as he always had. And as the release date approached, tension mounted to near unbearable levels, culminating in a disastrous Newman Enterprises gala intended to project unity and strength, where Victor, Nikki, and their children found themselves under the same roof for the first time since the ranch confrontation, and the atmosphere crackled with unspoken accusations and unresolved pain. And when Victor attempted to corner Nikki, accusing her of destroying their family, Nikki calmly reminded him that the family had been damaged long before the USB ever existed, by his choices, his secrets, and his belief that power justified anything. And when Victor warned her that exposure would ruin lives beyond his own, Nikki replied that secrecy already had. And as the clock struck midnight and guests toasted to legacy and longevity, Nikki slipped away to a secure location, where with trembling but resolute hands she initiated the release protocol, triggering the simultaneous distribution of the files to law enforcement, regulatory agencies, and multiple media outlets, ensuring that no single entity could suppress the truth. And as the first headlines began to break, cryptic at first, then explosive, Victor felt the full weight of consequence crash down upon him. As investigators arrived, warrants were issued, and his carefully constructed empire began to crumble under the scrutiny it had evaded for decades. And in the days that followed, Genoa City transformed into a battlefield of narratives, with Victor's defenders framing him as a ruthless but necessary force, while victims emerged from the shadows, emboldened by the evidence, sharing stories of intimidation, coercion, and lives irreparably altered by his actions. And Nikki watched from a distance as the man she loved became a symbol of unchecked power finally held accountable, experiencing moments of doubt and grief but never regret, because she knew that this reckoning, painful as it was, offered something Genoa City had long been denied: truth. And when Victor was finally arrested, not in handcuffs paraded before cameras but quietly, with dignity afforded by his status, Nikki felt no triumph, only a solemn sense of closure, because the gun she once raised had been replaced by something far more powerful: the refusal to remain silent. And as Victor was led away, he locked eyes with Nikki one last time, not with anger but with understanding, realizing too late that the woman he tried to control had become the instrument of his undoing. And as Genoa City adjusted to life without Victor Newman at its helm, alliances reshaped, wounds reopened, and futures reimagined, Nikki began the slow, difficult process of reclaiming her own identity beyond wife, protector, and accomplice, knowing that while the USB had broken her, it had also freed her, and that the legacy of this moment would ripple through generations, serving as a warning that even the most powerful men are not immune to the consequences of their darkest truths when finally brought into the light.